Hey everyone, before we start today's episode, I wanted to quickly tell you about the membership drive that I am doing on patreon.com/FireTheseTimes to celebrate over 2 years of this podcast. If we hit the goal of 100 new supporters at $5 or more a month or $50 a year, I'll be able to hire a producer, which would give me more time to focus on the research and interviews and actually start releasing 2 episodes a week instead of 1. If you become a supporter, in addition to getting early access to all episodes, you will also have access to our monthly hangout, in which myself and everyone else who supports this project come together and chat about pretty much everything. It happens every month on a Saturday, and you have access to the link and everything related to that on Patreon. And lastly, if you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing this podcast with your friends and families and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. This helps get more exposure to this podcast and introduce it to more folks. You can also follow this podcast and project on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Substack, and of course the main website. So thanks again everyone, and I hope you enjoy this conversation.
Hi, I'm Andrew. I'm the guy behind the YouTube channel Andrewism, pronouns he, him. I am an anarchist from Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm just really passionate about a lot of stuff.
I'm Emmi. I live in Aotearoa, and my pronouns are they, them. And yeah, I'm just a big old nerd. I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Okay, I'm Joey. I mean, I guess you folks know this since you're listening to my podcast. He, him. I'm currently in Switzerland for various reasons that are at best mildly interesting. And yeah, I'm also into a lot of stuff that we'll definitely get into. And so both Andrew and Emmi were guests on this podcast separately in the past. And I wanted to get them back on to talk about sort of like our separate journeys, if that's the right term. And I'm going to say if that's the right term a lot of the time because I'm very confused about vocab most of the time. But on like what got us quote unquote radicalized. And I guess a way to start is just really whatever comes to mind. I should say this is kind of cool. Like we're actually chatting around across 3 very different timelines. I'm recording this at like 10 p.m. Emmy, I don't know, 8 a.m. or something.
Yeah, 8 a.m.
And Andrew, I have no idea. 2 p.m. or something. I have no idea. I'm guessing
4 p.m.
4 p.m. Well, I mean, close enough. Whatever. Um, okay, so let me ask you this super vague question just because I'm not entirely sure how to start exactly, but how would you say, or how would you describe your trajectory in the sense of like in terms of how you see yourself having gotten radicalized at some point in your past? And I'm not gonna say like Andrew or Emmy, like whatever, whoever wants to start, just go for it.
Right. Well, for me at least, I think it just started with, my natural curiosity. I've always been very passionate about exploring all the different subjects and ideas and concepts and things that are out there. I started reading from a very early age. I started writing from a very early age, inventing stories, creating whole worlds and characters and places to sort of lay out all these ideas I had about how I could make the world better. And that was and is my goal, to try and make the world better. And so I was definitely, I would say, misled a bit. I wouldn't say misled. Misled, I guess, in terms of the direction. At least early on, I had a bit of a hiccup due to my past, religious background. It was a very conservative environment, but I came out of that because I felt that something wasn't right. I had a sense of empathy and a sense of morality that was derived from, you know, I wouldn't say it was entirely organic. I would say that, even though I came to disagree with my past beliefs, they did facilitate that somewhat. I basically came to the realization that empathy is really the path forward, and these ideas that I was being told were, love and truth and all these different things. I realized they did not align with what I saw to be love and what I saw to be truth. And so coming out of that, I still had this, voracious appetite for knowledge and for truth and for ideas and concepts. And so that led me, and of course, I still had my active imagination, and that led me in the direction of anarchism.
What about you, Emmi?
Yeah, so Andrew, first of all, I just want to say it's a really beautiful story, and well told. And I guess I was just gonna say first, that was a very beautiful story, very well told, and I respect your intellectual curiosity and the
Thank you.
bravery of kind of, being able to peek above the clouds in the context that you live. It's not an easy task, and also I really appreciate that you held on to these specific values of like truth and love and empathy, but that they took you outside of the framework in which they were introduced to you. That's like quite interesting to me, and something I can kind of relate to. I didn't come up from a religious background or a particularly conservative background. Um, I don't know. I feel like the story of radicalization for me is just the story of my life, which would be too long for a podcast. It's the story of all the relationships I've had, all the people I've respected, all the things that have happened to me, all the things that I've seen, the things that have happened to the people I love. So for me, it really feels like a process of relation. Although sometimes I feel quite alone in the sort of heterodox practices and beliefs that I hold, just because eventually you get to a point where you're creating your own thing. You're not like bound to representing some popular idea. You just have to be honest with yourself. Um, and so I feel like I identified as an anarchist for more than a decade, and I'm certainly still influenced by it, but I don't really take on political labels as I try not to take them on as identities, just kind of as some sort of thing about how my brain works that feels unhealthy to how my brain works. So I think of things as influences and tools. Um, I was influenced a lot by a lot of kind of global South radicals, POCs that I was working with or hanging out with or learning from in the Bay Area of California. Um, Before that, I was just kind of like doing my own thing, reading, nerding on the internet and stuff. But having these kind of communities like that had a big impact on me. And they were kind of like subsistence socialists, a lot of them. But at the same time, I was like homeless, so I was living in, hanging out in all these anarchist squats and stuff, and working with these different anarchist projects. I became very interested in prison abolition. I had both like these kind of like global South socialist types that were really rad, and then I had like these prison abolition friends, and then I had like these squatter anarchist friends, and I feel like I was learning from and with all of them in different ways. And then I just went through. I don't know. I lived in a lot of like quite poor, quite. I lived around a lot of police violence, and that certainly had a big impact on me, being like young and trans and homeless and stuff. Um, and so I just went through a lot of different phases in my political evolution, like generally being focused around some specific topic, um, and then building out conclusions from that. Like I was really into prison abolition for a while, and then I became really into restorative justice, transformative justice. And then I started dealing a lot in terms of like violent conflict, and then I became quite focused on anti-fascism, and now I'm quite invested in sort of the information warfare landscape and combating white supremacist movements. And now I yeah, I think Joey and I have both been kind of impacted and mortified by the scale of state-backed disinformation campaigns, especially around Syria. And then that led us to build relationships with people in like Hong Kong and now the Ukrainian crisis, who were experiencing similar stuff. Um, and so, uh, yeah, now living in Aotearoa, I feel like the main lens here of all politically radical groups is decolonization. I feel like it's not that it wasn't in the US, but that there's more indigenous political power here, because this country was formed by a treaty. So Maori forced the crown into treatying here. So that's the founding document of the country. And you can sue against the version that's in Te Reo Maori, for land back and things like that. So now I feel like I'm in this point in my life where I'm just like, I don't feel as certain as I did when I was younger about all of my politics. I feel very humbled by the scale of violence and crises that we face. I have beliefs that I hold very strongly, but I have a lens of uncertainty around pretty much all of them. And I'm just like in a position to be learning a lot, I think, all the time. Oh, and my last little thing about radicalization, I don't mind that word. I actually like it. I just don't like when people apply it to a horseshoe. Like,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't think that being far right is particularly radical in the sense of getting at the roots, like in the etymology of the word radical and what it actually means. Uh, I just think it's brash and incoherent. So I try not to give them that power.
Yeah, fair enough. Um, honestly, already
So
a lot. Yeah, go for it, Andrew. Sorry.
so just before you get into your
Mm-hmm.
story, Joey, I just wanted to respond to one thing that Emmy had said, when they were talking about identity and labels and identifying with a particular political program and viewing that as unhealthy. um I personally, like, I get that. I still say that I'm an anarchist, but I do get that as well. And it's actually the whole reasoning behind why my channel is called Andrewism, because I wanted my channel to just be a sort of a record of my political journey, sort of a public exploration of ideas and how those ideas synthesize my own brain, and my own experiences, my own context, all mixing together. That is what Andrewism is. And so what I think more people should be encouraging is just this approach to politics that is more personalized in
Mm.
terms of belief systems and how you apply it to your own life.
That's really beautiful. Yeah, I don't treat my rejection of labels, I worry, is like a little bit hipster. And I don't treat it as like an ultimate way that other people should interact. It's literally just particular to I have like OCD among other things, and I just get hung up on the implications of labels in ways that are time wasters. And so I just don't want to feel like I'm living up to an ideology. I would much rather be curious about what I deeply feel in my intuition, you know what I mean? And whatever that looks like, I don't want to play to a political team.
Mm.
Right.
But yeah, your approach to it is resonates a lot.
Yeah, it makes sense. I do kind of like. I had William Anderson on. He wrote this book on Black anarchism called "The Nation on No Map," and he quoted another person whose name I'm spacing out on, but essentially saying like, I don't run from it, so I don't run from the label of anarchism, but I don't run to it either. So it's for me. I kind of see it as one category that I'm very familiar with. It's a framework of viewing the world in many ways. It's very useful. It has its limitation, as with anything, really. And so sometimes if I kind of approach a certain topic, I approach it in an anarchist way, if that makes sense, and other times like in a feminist way. And not that these two are contradictory, obviously. For me, they're very much not. But it's like, oh, this is I'm approaching this topic from a certain language, certain framework that is mostly explained, if you want, by people who identify as feminists or by people who identify as anarchists or whatever. Um, and so, like my own background, I mean, yeah, I mean, as with both of you, it's just kind of going to be a summary. But I feel like just growing up in Lebanon alone is bound to make you either curious about the world or extremely cynical about the world. And personally, I I definitely went into the cynical side at some point in the past, and I think my rebelliousness phase, if we want to call it that, I may want to get into it a bit more because I know, Andrew, you mentioned somewhere else, like, I mean, you mentioned here as well, obviously, right? Like the um, having kind of conservative background and at some point at least flirting with right wing ideas or however you want to call it. In my case, um, it wasn't quite framed in a right wing sense, but ultimately I think it was. And that's because I really got into, when I was like in my teenage years, I got into like the new atheists, as they were called at the time. And that's like, the Sam Harris, Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, that sort of, those sorts of guys, and Daniel Dennett. And the reason, in retrospect, why that was the case is that the rebelliousness aspect of it is that I grew up in a context where religion is extremely politicized. Well, arguably that's always the case, but in Lebanon, I would say it particularly concentrated, and that was my way of sort of, saying fuck that or fuck all of it, essentially. And so I would be, yeah, there was a sense of, I don't know if the word is emancipation per se. That's probably a bit too much, but there was a sense of kind of freeing myself from. I also went to like a private Catholic school, and there was like, I don't know how to say it in English, but like a catechese, which is like Catholic studies every Wednesday, and every Friday there was church, and the chemistry teacher was a priest, and there was that entire vibe, and so that was for me a way of rejecting that. But that same gang, that same group of people, especially some Harris sense, obviously, and usually I don't name names, but I don't really care in this case. But like that same gang sort of also got into right wing stuff in Europe and in the US. Obviously, Hitchens supported the war in Iraq. Um, I forgot what the other. Some of them supported like the far right in the Netherlands. That sort of thing. And obviously, there was a underlying Islamophobia throughout their entire worldview, which I never fully shared, but I think when I was young, I wasn't smart enough to entirely reject it either. And so that was in my teenage years, and I'm not entirely sure what happened that got me out of it. Partly, I think it was just boredom. I'm also very curious, and I wanted to explore other stuff. And so at some point, I just got bored of reading their stuff, and I went to do something else. But then the other thing is that, as I said, just being in Lebanon and going to university in 2011, which is when the Arab Spring started. So that was, I think, almost inevitably going to, not inevitably, that's maybe a bit too much, but like definitely steered me towards that direction in terms of
I love this
activism.
idea of ADHD basically as a pathway out of like reactionary ideology. Lean in, get through the mimetic virus, get bored, move on. That checks
Yeah,
out. Same. I was kind of
does
a
check
history
out.
nerd for a minute
Uh,
too. I've believed all kinds of weird things
yeah,
just because that's how I have to get through an idea is I have to fully chew it, you know, and then the other side.
yeah, I actually get that. I get that. Um, Yeah, no, okay. So the other thing was just, I mean, the other thing, the next sort of question. I have these sort of titles in front of me of like themes to explore, but as usual on this podcast, kind of goes all over the place. But I wonder if the two of you can sort of speak to a bit more, in any case, to like the experience of growing up. If you can sort of take a step back, if that's at all possible. Emmy, maybe it's a bit easier for you because you're not in the US anymore, but Andrew, you're in Trinidad. But like, so how would you describe, as much as you can, what it was like to grow up in Trinidad, or what it was like to grow up in the US, and how do you think that affected? And I know this is super vague, but I mean, the question is kind of broad. But how do you think that affected your politics?
I think being in Trinidad influenced my politics in the sense of, well, regardless of my family's political, religious, because I mean, the politics and the religion came in a package. But regardless of that background, they still had a sense of anti colonial politic. Um, and that is something that I think you would find in most people, regardless of their political orientation, just by virtue of, coming from, our history and our context as a colonized nation. So, despite perhaps having a certain perspective on capitalism beforehand and having certain views on like feminism or whatever the case may be, I still had this sense of opposition to, these imperial powers that, drove us into the circumstances we're in today. And so I think that, for one, definitely influences things. Coming from an Afro-Trinidadian background in particular, and just having a sense of our history would have also played a role. Um, I think that my experience in the country, at least, would be a bit more, at least in the early stages, was a bit more sheltered because um, I had gone to school, yes, but only up until a certain point, and then from there, I was homeschooled and schooled myself and sort of navigated my preteens and teens um, in a home education context. So I would say that there were elements of life and reality that I would not have experienced the full breadth of, but I would say that I did get a good sense of life for the average Trinidadian, um, a good sense of the culture, and sort of seeing how some of these things, some of these ideas that the people hold, the suffering that people face, it helps me to get a sense of the necessity of significant change. Being of my generation and being in the global south, I also had a sense of impending climate collapse from a very early age, and so I was already in the process of seeking solutions to that. Um, I already had this sense of like a ticking clock, of time being up at some point. And so I think that also guided my politics because I still had that sense of environmentalism. I mean, I did also have like a pretty international outlook in terms of my education and the breadth of sort of books that I had read. And when I say that I was homeschooled, I don't mean to imply that I was literally at home all the time, because I did have a lot of experience socializing and interacting with people of a lot of different backgrounds. Um, so I think growing up in Trinidad just gave me a sense of all of the ways that colonialism affects like a society, all of the ways that people cope and adapt and deal with the traumas, intergenerational and so forth, that such a system would have introduced. And so I think that even now, just traveling or just living life, seeing how people interact, seeing the news, seeing the culture, seeing all these different circumstances, it's just that realization of the breadth and scope and depths of colonialism's impact. It makes me, it gives me a good recognition of how arduous and how lengthy and how um, multifaceted the process of decolonization will need to be to facilitate healing, to bring us to a place of strength and equality and autonomy and all of the values that I hold so dear.
That's amazing. I mean, what about you and the South of the
Yeah,
US?
so it's gonna be funny talking to you two because I grew up in the heart of empire. You know, uh, Lebanon is a country ravaged by U.S. foreign policy. one of the top militaries that, other than Israel, that the U.S. government and State Department have funded. And it's this site of contention. And I know less about the history of Trinidad and Tobago. Yeah, but what's up?
Tobago.
Yeah, I
Tobago.
actually knew that as soon as I said it. Sorry. And yeah, so growing up in the U.S., I don't know how to say this right, but the U.S., like being white in the U.S. especially, is a form of psychosis. Like, I say that in the sense of, like Amy Césaire and Frantz Fanon both talked about, like the psychosis caused by the violence of being a slaver, and basically how it destroyed people's minds. That degree of attempted power and violence, like, deeply messed up their ability to be basically a human being at the most fundamental level. And being in empire, in the heart of empire, there's like an aspect of that. Like, I grew up in very racially, culturally diverse settings. Like, the U.S. is such a big place. You'll talk to white people who basically didn't know a person of color until they went to college or something like that. That was not my experience. I was exposed to a pretty wide body of people, and also I have lived in from like lower middle class to like upper lower class in the US, but we've definitely experienced a lot of poverty at different times, a lot of chaos moving all around the country. And yeah, so basically the US projects power all over the world, destroys societies, commits genocide, but then it also doesn't give a fuck about anybody in the US aside from like certain privileged groups. And so you kind of get a sense of that constantly. And then, like, as I got older and I had more and more experiences, like, I'm a very sensitive person. Growing up, I got called a faggot a lot because I cried and I have a lot of feelings. And if I see other people having a lot of feelings, then I have a lot of feelings. So living in different contexts and seeing people have experiences that were different than my own certainly impacted me a lot. I saw a pretty intense example of police violence in San Francisco at one point, and I tried to engage, and like it was like a really volatile situation, and and I just like cried for weeks, not framing like my experience of that as the worst person's experience of that. Obviously, the worst person's experience of that was the target of police violence, who wasn't me. But stuff like that in the US like really impacted my view. And I guess I started believing pretty young that my freedom was entangled with other people's, like especially coming out as trans and like living in homeless shelters and stuff, and having a lot of like Black and brown trans femme community and like sex work community and stuff like that. There was really practical in ways in which like our mutual aid was critical for each other, and so it made it really obvious that our freedoms were entangled. But it also made me realize like more about what it meant to be white. Like, even in a highly precarious situation, there was still certain like forms of white privilege that I could try to leverage. Just knowing how to care in different systems, basically, and feeling entitled to do so. And so, yeah, I feel like I had to come to terms with that. And I feel like I've had a lot of very patient friends and lovers over my life who've like taught me a lot about myself and the space that I hold. Yeah, so now living not in the US anymore, I feel like I went through an experience of so much of what was latent in the US, or was the violence of the US that was being exercised constantly, is exploding in this more public way right now, along the lines of the global far right power grab that's happening. And being outside of the US, it just feels like leaving an abuser that's constantly trying to get you back. Like, there's like this parable in Spanish, I've only heard it in the Mexican context, about like crabs trying to crawl out of a boiling pot of water, and they keep trying to pull you back in because each one's trying to escape. And so, trying to escape, they pull you back into the hot water and nobody escapes. That's really how I feel about the US. It's just like a deeply unwell place that's falling apart at the seams, and the individualism just tears people apart. And so, you have to like, loving very deeply in the US is a weirdly radical thing, because you're not really supposed to build these deep meshes of resilient community. And so there's like a slightly countercultural aspect of doing so. But then at the same time, I've lived in places in the US, like in southern Arizona, where there was just huge, deeply developed radical community, with tons of systems and projects, and like, I basically everyone I knew was involved in radical political activism, and we all had shared language. And I don't know, the US is just a real complicated place. And so now that I'm away from it, I feel like I'm emotionally processing a persistent trauma, um, and not framing that trauma as like the ultimate trauma that you can experience. Obviously, it's a very privileged country to live. But I feel like living in Aotearoa is like, there's like a lot of things that, it's many, many problems, but there's a lot of things that just make more sense. Like, this is a really silly example, but um, like the word collective housing has a very different implication here. In the US, sharing groceries, like doing your grocery shopping together, is like this commune-esque hippie thing. That's like, ooh, wow, we bought our groceries together. It's like intentional housing and things like this. Whereas in New Zealand, it's just like, people are like, oh yeah, that's what being a roommate is. So if someone says that they're in a collective housing situation here, it's actually way more intense in my experience, because there's like more of that general culture of connecting. Um, yeah, so I feel like the US lies, and you internalize those lies when you live there. And so part of living in the US is is trying to break away from those lies and the harms that they cause by having empathy, basically, as Andrew would frame it.
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't really know how to explain this
I,
shift, because I'm
I
still in
think
the
you
middle of it.
I think you did honestly really well. um, so let me okay. So I'll only mention one aspect of growing up in Lebanon, which I just think is most interesting to our conversation, because I think I talk about Lebanon way too much already on this podcast. Um, but it's just the overwhelming presence and awareness of borders. And that's something I never quite understood. So Lebanon, for those who don't know, only has two neighbors. It's a very tiny country, but it has two neighbors that are either bigger and or more powerful. And those two neighbors are Syria and Israel. Um, Not the easiest neighbors to have, granted. Um, and I never quite understood how internalized my I mean, I think it's a form of, honestly, I think I would describe it as claustrophobia, and how internalized it became, and how, why, for example, when I was living in Scotland at some point I felt so freer. It's because there wasn't really any borders anywhere near. I mean, there was the English one, but that doesn't really count because it's the UK anyway. Well, for now. um but I was always, yeah, I felt much more comfortable there because you can go, north and you can go south, and no one will stop you because it's an island, right? So, but the first before, like long before that, I would visit Europe a lot because I have family here, and I very clearly remember the first time, or at least one of the first times I crossed a border, and that was between Switzerland and France. Um, and I just remembered being just amazed that nothing happened because for the most part the borders are just there and they're not, sometimes there are checks, but the checks are just kind of a formality if you have papers. Obviously, if you don't have papers, it's a much different problem. Um, but on mostly the roads we were taking stuff, like it's not a thing essentially. Like people just you have people who live across the border and they forget that the border is there. They only remember if it's like a different currency because Switzerland and France have different currencies, or whatever, like there's a flag somewhere or whatever, something that reminds you that you're now in a different nation state. Well, in Lebanon that is impossible. If you go to the south and then you decide you want to go further south, you get shot at. Well, I think it's physically impossible to do so anyway, but if you manage somehow, you get shot at. And if you want to go to Syria, that's dangerous for very different reasons, especially if you're an activist like me.
Not to
So
mention that Lebanon was occupied by Syria.
yeah. So that's the other thing. Thanks. I mean, like Lebanon at some point was occupied by both Israel and Syria at the same time. They co-occupied Lebanon for like 18 years, more or less in total together, ish. Um, Israel between 82 and 2000, although they had a small occupation before that, and Syria between, well, I don't quite know when to start Syria, but roughly between 76 and 2005, more or less. Um, and so that's always something that, and I think that's something that many people in Lebanon grew up with, but don't necessarily, because it's internalized. And I had to go through a process. I'm literally doing a PhD on this shit. Like, I had to go through a process of taking a step back, and that's what first Scotland, but especially Switzerland's been for me, because as far as things happening on a daily basis, it's like as opposed, like as not Lebanon as it gets. And that I found kind of, yeah, it allowed me to just take a step back and kind of care for myself a bit more in the past couple of years, even though it's been a pandemic, obviously. But yeah.
I it's funny that you bring that up. I don't know why I didn't think of it sooner, but yeah, living on the Turkish-Syrian border and also living on the US-Mexico border deeply, deeply changed the way that I think about the world. It's not like I didn't have a critique of nation states, but the sort of liminality and mixing and violent imaginary constructions of the places, um, yeah, it really drove home like freedom of movement for me, and feeling like Border Patrol was a fascist occupation, like a low-key terror organization.
Hmm.
So yeah, and yeah,
I think another aspect of really highlighting the violence of borders and just the inanity of borders, for a lot of people, for those who don't live in those environments, it's something I brushed against recently. Is just the whole visa application process, particularly in entering the US, even just to visit. It's just utterly absurd.
Yep.
I remember when I was actually in the line for my visa interview, because I had a visa before and I had to renew it. Um, the lady in front of me, she had all her documents and stuff prepared, and she just answered all the questions and whatever. But the thing about a visa application is that they've already decided if they're going to give you a visa long before you come for the actual interview. The interview
Yep.
itself is really just a formality. And so this lady would have spent however many, I think it's 1,000 and something TT dollars, which is about 150 US. So she spent that much money to, pay for this. And of course, they don't give you your money back. And so she paid for the whole application process, and she got her documents ready, and she came for the interview, and she answered all the questions, and she was just denied. And just like that, that's it. You're entirely cut off from moving freely to that part of the world just because this settler colonial state says you cannot. Another thing that makes it worse is that in Trinidad, at least, because we are in the Caribbean, a lot of connecting flights go through the US. And if you're not allowed to enter the US at all, it makes it very difficult to travel, to go where you need to go.
It's weird the difference between like now Aotearoa doesn't have land borders because we're just several islands in the ocean, whereas U.S. Mexico has this highly militarized land border. So like the no border movement hits a little different when there's no land border,
Oh,
but obviously
yes.
there's still this like visa nationalism kind of thing.
What makes it also interesting in Trinidad is we are also an island nation, a twin island nation, but we are literally right next to Venezuela. And so during the Venezuelan crisis, a lot of Venezuelans have come to Trinidad because it's like a 5 minute boat ride. And so it really highlights the unity of borders because it's practically impossible to enforce that kind of, or to restrict that kind of movement when there's such closeness between people. And especially since for centuries prior to colonialism, there's been like a constant exchange between the South American mainland and the entire Antilles. And so the fact that these states just come and set up shop and say, "Oh well, you can't move anymore," it's absurd. It's a flagrant violation of the freedom of movement that people have enjoyed for generations.
It's just so obviously a protection of imperial capital, like, and increasingly so as the climate crisis like continues. It's like we need to ensure that the people who suffer from extractive colonialism uh, cannot seek access to resources that are being hoarded by the colonizing countries. Uh, it's just so like obvious.
I was born in France, but I don't have the citizenship. Um, and I always found it, and this is one of those things that kind of understood retroactively, but like, I mean, in retrospect. So I was born in France. I have like French cousin, like French citizen, like cousins who have the French citizenship, and I also have cousins who have the Swiss one. And my dad is a naturalized Swiss citizen as well. And so every time I wanted to visit, let's say my father growing up, I would have to go to the Swiss embassy in Beirut and apply for a visa. And they would always give you a pretty short term one. Like I remember once I got one, I was going to visit him for like 15 days, and they gave me one for like 17 days, something like that. And at some point, it it just dawned on me of like, so the contrast that or the example I wanted to give is that like the fact that I would come to this continent essentially where I started my existence, but every time I wanted to come to it, to physically be in it, I had to ask someone's permission, and obviously I have to pay a shit ton of money because the visa application, as Andrew mentioned, tends to be quite expensive. And when I went to the UK, the first time around, my first visa was fine. Like the first visa application was okay. But then the second time around, when I reapplied to essentially, had to go back to Lebanon to then reapply for the visa. I was in the UK, but in order to do the PhD in the UK, I had to go back to Lebanon and apply for the visa again to go to the UK. And so that process was basically first time around, I mean, the second application, but the second time I applied, they said no, like they rejected the visa. And the reasoning they gave is that they were not convinced of my level of English. And that's after I got a master's degree from a UK university. And so the second time around, I applied with the exact same documents, and they determined my English to be sufficiently good enough for me to then go to Scotland. Um, and for me, it was just that. I just interpreted this as like, well, this is obviously just a money scheme. Like I just applied for a second visa again. I had to pay all over the same documents, all of that stuff. I had to pay for it again, and they don't reimburse you, as Andrew mentioned. And it's something that people who are in Europe, who have the citizenship in Europe, with the exception of racialized folks who can still be stopped even if they have the citizenship of their respective countries. But many people here really take it for granted, and I've always wondered what that's like. Like I don't even know if like that's envy necessarily, but I don't know what it's like to have this site, like this big space that you can just go from one area in that space to another area in that space, and if you're stopped, at best you can just say hello officer, and then you continue and no one bothers you. I don't know what that's like, and
I
that's
mean,
something that really baffles me.
like, you know that US mostly don't have to pay for visas, right? If you're a US citizen, you
Yeah.
mostly don't have to pay for visa applications. And US imperialism is really wild too. You can go like 100 miles into Mexico without ever showing your passport, or without passing any kind of border security. There's just like a dude sitting on a chair asleep or like looking at his cell phone if you're going south. But if you're going north, it's like a 3 hour wait at the border. Um,
Yeah, same between Europe and North Africa. There's the enclave in northern Morocco, which is a Spanish enclave, and you can do the boat ride from like southern Europe to North Africa, and that's fine. There's no danger there. You're totally safe and everything. But obviously, if you're in North Africa and you're trying to reach southern Europe, you can literally lose your life. And we're talking about a distance that in ancient times, like the ancients, as we call them, were describing those like as nothing, because it's the landmass, especially around Gibraltar, isn't even that big, but it's militarized, so that's what makes it big. It's geographically small, but politically it becomes a huge distance, if you see what I mean.
it's interesting that we all kind of stumbled into this meatiness of thinking about borders and freedom of movement. And I'm wondering, like, there's the endless of how bad it is that we could talk about and analyze and examples. I kept thinking about how borders often cut across indigenous territories that have been, in southern Arizona, it's like 6,000 years of continuous inhabitants cut by a
Mm-hmm.
border, now cut by a
Mm-hmm.
wall. And
Mm-hmm.
then that wall, like, changes the cultures on both sides. Um, but I'm wondering if there's something like positive or beautiful that this traumatic infrastructure has caused us all to believe in. Like, there's something about freedom of movement. I feel like there's something more there that we are all imagining. Maybe it's like a form of resistance to imperialism or something, or like interconnectedness of peoples.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just
Yeah.
wondering if that
I
was something for you all.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I just see this as such an impoverishment of, and like the potential of life can be so much more interesting, and it is just being limited by these relatively arbitrary concepts and social constructs whose purpose is to essentially keep certain people out and keep certain people in. Essentially, the metaphor of a fortress, which in Europe, fortress Europe has become pretty popular term to describe this phenomenon. But that's why, like, I've always had this fascination with reading old, and by old I mean like maybe 100 years old, not even that much older than that. But even reading something like the Orient Express, that book by Agatha Christie, and just the idea that you could do that, like you could be on a train from Jerusalem or wherever it left from, and you go to, I think, Istanbul, and from Istanbul you can take a train to go to Paris. Like today, that's insanity. Like you literally, I mean, in the sense that it's impossible to think about that. Like my brain has difficulties even conceptualizing something that isn't that complicated, distance wise. If you're in the southern border of Lebanon and like Israel Palestine, you're closer to Haifa than you are to Beirut, and the train distance would be like, I don't know, 40 minutes maybe between Jerusalem and Beirut if there was a train. But because of the border, it's impossible. It's just not. It's something that you can even. I personally, I have lots of difficulties even imagining something like that being the case. Well, it was the case just like 2 generations ago or 3 generations ago.
I feel like I'm gonna have to cut out. You guys can do whatever you want. I know that you were gonna ask me about books,
Mm-hmm. Can you? Are you?
but
Do you have time to recommend 3 books?
I simply do not read, Joey. No, I just my work and the world is so intense. I mostly just listen to Joy like interesting, distracting audiobooks while I'm cleaning or doing childcare or something. So like the audiobooks I've listened to recently were this book called Hench, which is about a temp agency for villains. Um, I just read. I've been reading a lot of graphic novels. I just read this graphic novel called Private Eye, and I really like the author's work. Unfortunately, they use like the R slur a fair amount in everything I've read about them, which seems absurd considering they also have like trans characters and stuff. Whatever. I'm reading this book right now called like Light from Uncommon Stars. It's like queer sci-fi weird thing. I just read for distraction. I don't read for becoming more depressed these days.
I mean, I think that's fair enough, to be honest.
Y'all are so sweet. I always learn so much from both of you.
um, Andrew, if you want, I figured I had like two more themes I wanted to explore with the three of us, but if that's okay with you, we can do it just like the two of us.
Sure.
Um, One was like we kind of talked about it last time you were around, actually, but on Solarpunk, which obviously is a topic that I think on this podcast specifically was first mentioned by Emmy, if I'm not mistaken, in the when I asked them to recommend books, and they said something along the lines of like anything Solarpunk or Afrofuturism, because, and here I'm paraphrasing, um, they said something along the lines of, I'm amazed at people still finding hope despite everything, or something along those lines. And I guess I just wanted to ask you, um, and and also I want to say, like, after they said that, I think one of the things I did was just like type in Solarpunk on YouTube, and I found your video, and then obviously I had you on as well on the podcast. Can you talk more about your journey into Solarpunk, if that makes sense? And do you see this as a framework alongside anarchism, or which maybe complements anarchism or whatever, which allows you to maintain hope, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I just kind of came upon Solarpunk through Tumblr and just liked it and sort of inspired some of my earlier offline projects. But in terms of its intersection with anarchism, I think that anybody who is inspired by Solarpunk ideas, who really digs deeply into the motivations behind Solarpunk, why Solarpunk as an aesthetic has come about, why what Solarpunk espouses as its values. I think anarchism is a natural conclusion. I don't think you need to be an anarchist to hold to Solarpunk values, but I think that if you're not at least leaning towards libertarian socialist directions, decolonial directions, egalitarian directions, direct democracy of some sort. If you're not like, you know, looking to establish the commons as opposed to, uprooting the concept of private property, I'm not sure that you have fully investigated the natural conclusions that Solarpunk would bring about.
So what I want to say on Solarpunk specifically, like the thing that kind of got me into it, if you want, or that kind of persuaded me to explore it a bit further, is like I do cultural studies, and so one thing that I do a lot is pay attention to media, watch movies, watch series, that sort of thing, and try to understand as much as I can what are the underlying themes, what's like, you know, dominant tropes, what are certain stories that we tell ourselves, or what are certain stories that are dominant in popular cultures, that sort of thing. And one very common, or one very obvious thing about and almost a lot of movies, almost all movies that have to do with predicting the future, whether it's like, apocalyptic or dystopian or what have you, even cyberpunk, the vast majority of them tend to be very negative in one way or another. Yeah, like the idea of a future, like just the representation of the future in quite a lot of movies, tends to be essentially saturated with cyberpunk, apocalyptic stuff, dystopian stuff, that sort of thing. And to be honest, I just got really tired of it. I mean, I'm not against dystopias or whatnot. I think they can be quite useful if they're done well. Like, Octavia Butler's stories would be an obvious one, an obvious example. But I just needed something else. I needed something that, after watching it, doesn't just leave me, feeling helpless and paralyzed and whatever. And that's what sort of brought me into Solarpunk. Really, like I feel like my origin story, so to speak, is actually pretty straightforward and pretty simple. And since then, I've been interested a lot in. I love writing as well, but I'm not very good at the fiction aspect of it. So I'm trying to develop the non-fiction aspect of it, like sort of also what you do on your YouTube channel. Trying to understand, like, where can this take us. Where I'm currently finishing writing an essay for New Lines on Solarpunk, which would probably be out by the time this episode is out, actually. So I'll link it in the description, or people can look it up. Essentially, like, on the power of Solarpunk, like, why do I feel like this is something that gives me energy, essentially. And needing something that gives you energy is, I feel, something that still tends to be, and I don't know what you think about this, Andrew, but I feel like it's still something that's, like, underappreciated in a lot of, activist circles, lefty circles, what have you. Like, just needing something that fuels you. um yeah, just that, really. Fuels you with some positivity in order to be able to deal with the shit of the world.
Right, yeah. That is definitely a necessity because without something to drive you, it's like you're just really waiting for burnout to happen.
Exactly. And I'm 31 now, and I've been taking part in, like, protests and whatnot roughly since I was like 19. And I think I can think of so many people who started roughly around the same time, or even started later, especially in Lebanon, but not just in Lebanon, who are, like, completely burnt out now, who are unable to do anything, unable to take part in anything, pretty cynical a lot of the time, or at the very least very pessimistic. Which, pessimistic, honestly, is fair enough. Cynicism is a very understandable feeling. For me, it's something that I'm very familiar with, but I always try and fight back against it, or at least in my case, try and push back against it, because I feel like it's um, like it just, yeah, it's a very debilitating. If that's, I don't even know if that's the correct word, and I hope it's not problematic, but it's definitely something that makes me feel paralyzed, like, unable to deal with the world, really, when I end up feeling cynical. It just ends up being this, like, fuck everything, everything's pointless, everything's dumb, I'm just gonna withdraw, whatever. And that, I don't find that to be quite productive. I think it's okay to go through phases and even days and whatnot where you're like, fuck everything and you just want to withdraw. I think that's fine, and that could just be your body saying, like, yeah, take a step back and whatever. But I certainly don't think this is something that should be the main thing, or the main framework you approach the world from, if you see what I mean. And for me, Solarpunk, alongside, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, like, alongside anarchism, alongside feminism, alongside so many other things, is like one tool among many. And it's something that allows me to enter conversations that otherwise, I think, wouldn't be accessible in the same way, if that makes sense. I have been in situations in the past few months, I've been trying this out. Because when you say I'm an anarchist, or when you say, or anarchism, if you say that word, many people just assume something and they kind of turn off, like, just don't listen, or they don't. It's something that's already saturated with a lot of imagery and a lot of, like, popular culture or whatever. But if you say, like, solar punk, if you say, like, yeah, I'm been getting into this solar punk thing, I'm talking about it, I'm writing about it, so much of the time I've actually gotten, puzzled looks or curiosity, like, oh, what is that? I go, can you what does that actually mean? Can you talk about it? And so on. And sometimes doesn't people just, yeah, they zone out after that, but other times I feel like it clicks with some people, and that's powerful.
Yeah, simple as. I think what people don't realize, and is in itself, getting all hung up on these, ideological titles and labels and figures and whatnot. What people are just looking for is something to inspire, something to push them to be better and to make the world better.
Okay, so to sort of wrap up, I wanted to ask you this, like, what gives you hope today?
Um, I'm very much a planner. Um, in fact, recently I was doing some cleaning because I was doing some moving, and I found some old books of mine, and I saw that from my early teens and even going back, I had these lists going year by year, planning everything I wanted to do. And of course, some things have changed, some ideas have changed, what I want to be has changed. But the general outline has been pretty consistent. And so I think what gives me hope, despite all the issues in the world right now, despite the overwhelming sense of calamity, despite the fact that while I could never change the entire world, the best I can do is affect as much as I can where I can. What gives me hope is that recognition that while I cannot necessarily change the entire planet, I can change my corner of it and the people that I touch. What gives me hope is the sense that I at least have some sense of direction of what I want to do, where I want to go, what I want to be. And so that gives me a sort of rudder. It gives me something to look towards, to guide me even when I feel a little bit lost. And so having that sense of direction is, I think, what gives me hope. One of my major goals that keeps me going, that gives me hope, other than the book that I've been writing, which is about the Caribbean past, present issues, and future oriented solutions. Um, More information on that should be coming out once I finished it. Is the project that I think I've had for a very long time now, in some form or another, even before I heard about permaculture, which is this idea of establishing a sort of hub upon which like other activities could sort of spread out of, a sort of like a home base, where permaculture practices could be expanded and established and used to educate others and spread those ideas, and to sort of be the first of many, um, to sort of try and kick off a movement for food autonomy and political autonomy and education, um, on these islands. And so that goal is what's keeping me going. And I'm still in the early stages of it. I'm still in talks with a lot of different people. Still thinking about how I would go about funding it. But
Mm,
it's definitely something that an idea that excites me and keeps me hopeful. It's my little Solarpunk pet project.
amazing. That's amazing. Okay, well, I mean, on that note, since we're talking about a book, what are three books that you would recommend to our listeners, and why those three?
For one, and I think I recommended it the first time I was on here, Anarchy Works by Peter Gelderloos, just because it's such a great general overview of a lot of the common questions, that people tend to have about anarchism. I would also like to shout out Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, even though it's not a new book, and it's something I only read quite recently. What I find interesting about it, while reading it, is that a lot of the ideas that he was talking about, even before I read his work, I had those ideas and I discussed those ideas in some form, in my written works in the past, my videos in the past. And so it's just really interesting to see, and that's what excites me about, all these ideas, that people arrive at similar conclusions from different places. Um, we both come from colonial contexts, Paulo Freire being Brazilian and me being Trinidadian, but we still came to some sense of how colonial education impacts people, and trying to find an alternative and a path forward. So I definitely recommend that book. It's pretty short. And lastly, I want to recommend Prefigurative Politics by Paul Raekstad, because it is such a brilliant overview of one of the most essential strategies, and approaches to revolution today, to social revolution today. Because a lot of people have this sense of revolution that is just, oh, this big flashy moment where we all storm the Bastille and chop off the heads and this eat the rich and this, that, and the other. When the reality is that revolution is more of like a slow burning process of, in some cases, yes, destruction. And in fact, in a lot of cases, yes, destruction, because a lot of things need to be destroyed. In other cases, creation, because a lot of things we need to build, a lot of infrastructure we need to put in place before any kind of rupture would be viable. And of course, places of transition where elements of an institution or a circumstance or whatever just needs to be transformed and brought into the control of the masses. And so I think that Prefigurative Politics by Paul Raekstad does a really good job of exploring that aspect of it, and talking about how we go about with these institutions, putting them in place, answering common objections. And I think it's just an excellent overview of how we do revolution. And I think more people should be reading it, especially this time.
Amazing. And where can people find you online?
So you can find me on youtube.com/Andrewism. And you can find me on Twitter at _SaintTrue. And of course on patreon.com/SaintTrue.
Amazing. Well, Andrew, all that's left for me is to really thank you for this amazing conversation with you and Emmi.
I'm glad to be
And
here.
I'm sure we'll do something soon together again.
Bet.
The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.